In 1983, President Ronald Reagan addressed the National Association of Evangelicals and issued a sharp rebuke to the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire. But what often goes overlooked is how he framed that warning. He tied it not just to foreign threats, but to domestic anxieties, saying this: well, if history teaches us anything, it teaches that self delusion in the face of unpleasant facts is folly. Reagan wasn't just speaking about missiles and diplomacy, he was speaking to a growing concern that American culture, family, and economy were under siege. That speech became a symbol of the decade, a moment where politics, religion, and identity collided in a way that still echoes today.
Welcome back to APUSH for All. Today we're turning the clock back to the 1980s, transformative and deeply complicated decade in American history. Reagan may dominate the headlines, but this episode isn't just about one man, it's about a broader conservative shift, culture wars, economic realignments, and the rise of a new American identity.
And we'll hear voices from across the spectrum. When I do that Reagan voice, I'll try to do a little bit better. That was weak sauce.
I thought it was good.
But Reagan's Morning in America, optimism, to inner city youth expressing disillusionment in early hip hop lyrics. Stick around.
All right, real quick, you might be wondering, did Miss Keltner get voted off the island? And in
Never.
fact, she's still here. She's with us. She's on a field trip. She should be joining us shortly, but we're going to kind of Frankenstein this podcast a bit, put it all together in pieces. So don't freak out, Miss Keltner fans. She will return shortly. But for now, stick with Mr. Hill and I as we guide you through the 80s. And we want to really start from this broad perspective. And our focus today is the rise of a new conservative movement in the 1980s as a reaction to what many saw as the excesses of liberalism and government expansion from the New Deal all the way up to the Great Society.
And who better symbolizes that shift than Ronald Reagan? I mean, honestly, I think a lot of people still consider us, to a large extent, still living in Ronald Reagan's America. So he's elected in 1980. Reagan's victory wasn't just about winning an election. It represented a powerful backlash to the perceived failures of the 1970s. We're talking about stagflation, that nasty little combination of high inflation and unemployment. Plus, you had the energy crisis. Plus, you had the Watergate scandal and the deeply humiliating Iranian hostage crisis that dominated the final year of Jimmy Carter's presidency. Americans were feeling pessimistic. There was this prevailing sense that the country had lost its way.
And Reagan understood that mood perfectly. He really tapped into this anxiety about America's place in the world and the direction that it was heading. He was charismatic, optimistic, and framed his candidacy as a way to restore America, which should be surprising. We know that he was an actor back in the day, right?
He was the Gipper.
He was the Gipper. He had this his roots in Hollywood, so he knew how to sell a message. I mean, he was a spokesperson too, so he really understood how to convey his vision for his new vision for America. In fact, his campaign theme was, quote, "Let's make America great again."
It sounds oddly familiar.
Yeah, I think we've heard that before. I mean, and in fact, it wasn't. I don't think Reagan really even came up with it. It goes all the way back to kind of the America First mentality that we saw during the isolationism of the 1930s. So, but still, what Reagan did is he tapped into people's longing for order, strength, and national pride coming out of the 1970s, and he promised a smaller federal government, lower taxes, but also, somewhat paradoxically, a stronger military and a return to so-called traditional values.
So, and the quintessential line that we attribute to Reagan that really dominates this entire period is this line: "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. And that's from his first inaugural address in 1981, which brings us to ubiquitous term, Reaganomics, a term often used to describe his economic policy. At the heart of this was the idea of supply side economics, which argued that if you reduce taxes, especially on businesses and the wealthy, you free up capital for investment, which would then trickle down to everyone else through job creation and economic growth.
His 1981 economic recovery tax slashed the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 50%, and later went even lower, although from today's perspective, that sounds pretty high.
Absolutely, compared with what we have today.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised to compare today, which I think it's like 33 is the top tax.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, but that just goes to show how our attitudes about taxes ebb and flow. But also, there's this idea of deregulation. And deregulation in industries like transportation and energy in particular. The results of Reaganomics, supply side theory, well, it kind of depends on who you ask.
And if you asked the Congressional Budget Office in 1989, they said that the top 1% of Americans saw their share of national income rise from 8% in 1980 to over 13% by 1988. Meanwhile, homelessness surged. Crack cocaine devastated urban communities. And while Reagan preached about family values, funding for public housing and mental health was cut. So there's a real duality that we see in the 1980s. On the one hand, you had affluence and confidence. On the other hand, you had this widening inequality.
And culturally, too, it was a transformative moment. You had the rise of the so-called moral majority, an evangelical Christian political organization founded by the famous Jerry Falwell, who played a key role in galvanizing conservative voters around these social issues that we continue to talk a lot about today, such as abortion, school prayer, and traditional family roles.
Right. Personal politics. And this is something that you did not see this confluence before between, religion and politics. Jerry Falwell in 1981 says this: "We are no longer ashamed to say that we are pro-family, pro-God, and pro-America." So you had this, like I said, this confluence of religion and politics for the very first time, for the very first time. And on the other side of the cultural divide, you had MTV launched in 1981, bringing music and visual culture together. Dr. Garrison, I was there in the flesh when the Buggles busted on the scene with Video Killed the Radio Star. My brother and I saw it live.
So. And how about that?
Yeah, I'm pretty old, is what I'm saying.
Well, but also, I mean, you've seen some great moments.
Oh my God,
unbelievable!
No question.
It really is interesting how there's this almost symmetry between the rise of the new right moral majority and at the same time the explosion of MTV and this cultural twist or shift that happens again right at the same time that part of the country is moving right artistically and culturally. Another part of the country is moving in these new directions in a very open and energetic way. And no better way to understand this really than MTV, because it wasn't just a new cable channel. It redefined how Americans, and in particular teenagers, consumed culture. I mean, for the first time, you had music that was inseparable from the idea of the image of the artist. And you could see this happening in real time with music videos that were like these mini narratives, these marketing tools and expressions of identity. And it was a huge shift from earlier decades where music was just mostly heard and not watched.
Case in point, I remember there being days in high school where girls would be like, hey, we're going to go meet at Aunt Jeanette's house after school today to see the new Michael Jackson video. And all of a sudden, kids at school would, instead of saying, did you hear that song on the radio, they would say, did you see the video? And so that completely changed. And indeed, as media historian Michael Serrazio says about MTV, MTV changed the business of music and the business of America. The channel didn't just reflect youth culture, it shaped it. And the artists who rose to prominence through MTV, they pushed boundaries. Madonna, for example, took control of her image and used fashion and sexuality and religion to provoke and empower. And there was a lot of provocation there. Her 1984 performance of Like a Virgin at the MTV Video Music Awards was controversial, but it was also iconic.
Right, and that's gets back to what we were saying. Simultaneously, you had Falwell preaching family values and the importance of traditional roles in American society, and you had Madonna performing on MTV. So I mean, you had these two things happening at the same time, which goes to show that America is never just one thing. It's always the tension between these two currents. You could look, for example, at Prince and his Purple Rain film with a soundtrack that blended race, gender fluidity, and rebellion in ways that both captivated but also unsettled mainstream audiences. I mean, Prince challenged the rigid binaries of American culture, and he blurred them with this unique style and a certain type of swagger.
So this last November, October actually, we made a pilgrimage. We were in Minneapolis, and while we were there, we had to go visit Paisley Park, Prince's house.
Nice.
And, I had to buy something. I came away with some bright purple socks, and so that was my kind of homage to Prince. Prince notwithstanding, but maybe the most politically charged of all were hip hop artists like Public Enemy, who exploded onto MTV later in the decade. Video musics that they produced, like Fight the Power, weren't just entertainment, they were unequivocally protest. They confronted systemic racism, police brutality, and Black empowerment head on.
Let's not forget the pushback that occurred as a result. Again, it's the yin and the yang. It's the give and the take. Groups like Parents Music Resource Center, what a great and inspiring name, which was co-founded by Tipper Gore, criticized explicit lyrics and imagery. In 1985, they lobbied Congress and helped usher in the parental advisory labels on albums. Boo. I mean, come on, so lame.
Yeah, exactly.
The tension between free expression and moral panic. I mean, come on, this is a hallmark of the culture wars that defined the era then and continues to define culture today.
You know, it's the if it's too loud, you're too old.
That's right. Turn it up to 11.
So Tipper Gore said in 1985, "We're not censors, we're parents." And so what she really meant was we're censors.
And it kind of came on one hand, it actually ended up having the opposite consequences of its intended consequences, I should say, right? So what ends up happening is kids are like, why is this music labeled inappropriate? Why is it being labeled as something I shouldn't listen to? I'll tell you what, I'm gonna go buy it and make sure I listen to it. It almost was like labeling stuff as extra cool by putting that on there. It had the opposite effect, essentially. All right, so when we talk about music and political protest and how these two intersect, it also kind of leads us to talk about the AIDS crisis. It's very sobering to have to think about how this crisis emerges in the early 1980s, when in June 1981 the CDC reported a rare form of pneumonia in 5 previously healthy young men in Los Angeles. Now, all of them were gay, and it was the first official recognition of what became a national and global health crisis.
But AIDS didn't emerge in a vacuum. It struck hardest in communities that had only recently begun to gain visibility. During the 1970s, the gay rights movement had made major strides. Harvey Milk was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977, one of the first openly gay officials in U.S. history. And the 1970s had seen increasing numbers of LGBTQ Americans organizing, marching, and demanding recognition. As Harvey would say in 1977, hope will never be silent.
But that progress came again with backlash. When the AIDS epidemic began, it was often dismissed as just a quote-unquote gay disease, with the media using terms like the gay plague, and many in power, including almost the entirety of the Reagan administration, just simply ignored the crisis. I mean, Reagan didn't even publicly speak about AIDS until 1985, by which point over 5,000 Americans had died, and in response, activists mobilized. Groups like ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which formed in 1987, demanded faster drug approval, public education, government accountability, and their motto was as urgent as their tactics: silence equals death. They staged die-ins and took over FDA offices and made sure the crisis couldn't be ignored. As Larry Kramer, the playwright and ACT UP co-founder, declared in a 1988 protest speech, quote, "We are fighting for our lives." And here's the key in terms of historical continuity. This activism was built on earlier strategies. We can look back to the civil rights and the women's rights movement, where marches, media pressure, legal challenges were all familiar tools. The difference is that now they're being used to fight a deadly virus and a culture of indifference. There's other intersections here too. Many early AIDS activists were also veterans of the Stonewall era or part of the 1970s feminist and liberation movement. So increasingly, allies from the arts world, musicians, actors, and of course MTV began to be platforms on which activists could speak out. MTV in particular aired PSAs and specials by the late 1980s. They were helping to educate young audiences. Artists like Madonna used their platforms to advocate explicitly for AIDS awareness and gay rights. And that's this other side of MTV's cultural power. It didn't just define fashion and music, it eventually amplified these marginalized voices. And this is one of those moments where pop culture and politics collide in a very real, very human way, similarly to the way that religion and politics are going to intersect. The fight for LGBTQ rights in the 1980s wasn't just about marriage or visibility, it was just literally a fight for survival.
I have returned.
Oh, I think we were all so worried.
I know. I'm sorry that I'm a tad late today. And it was like Mr. Hill and I are ships passing in the night. He had to leave and I showed up late. So the only constant here is Dr. Garris.
No, I'm the bridge.
I mean, you are the backbone of this podcast.
The glue.
You really are. Like you do the most work ahead of time. You're the one always posting it.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, you really are.
Don't make me blush.
Well, I don't know what it is in me today, but I'm being really nice. So, happy to be here, everybody. We're talking about the 80s, I hear.
That's true.
Allegedly, we're talking about the 80s. Okay, so let me pick up where you guys left off. So, Morning in America. Hello, it's Morning in America again. And this was the nickname given to a TV commercial that was officially called Prouder, Stronger, Better. And this ran as an ad for Reagan's 1984 reelection campaign. And it opened with serene visuals of people starting their day. They're raising American flags. They're going to work. They're getting married. They're buying homes. While a calm, hopeful narrator says, and I quote, "It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history." And this was the optimistic tone, nostalgic tone, emotionally reassuring that Reagan's campaign wanted to highlight. And it suggested that after the turmoil of the 60s and 70s with Vietnam, Watergate, inflation, the Iran hostage crisis, that America had returned to strength, confidence, and prosperity under Reagan's leadership.
Right, and on the surface, it's all sunshine and optimism. It's this new dawn, but if you look a little closer, that slogan was doing a lot of work. It wasn't just a clever ad, it was a carefully constructed narrative about who belongs in America, what values matter, and more importantly, what version of American history are we returning to?
Yeah, and the ad portrayed white middle-class families buying homes. Like I said earlier, they're raising their flags early in the morning. They're attending, weddings that are specifically in churches, Christian churches, most likely. And there were no signs of urban poverty, no nods to racial injustice, no acknowledgement of the AIDS crisis or Cold War fears or of, this war on drugs that Reagan is eventually going to declare. And the point is that Morning in America wasn't just a celebration of the nation, it was actually a curation of it. And that all rhymed.
It did.
Yeah, and I didn't even mean to do that.
You're a
and it
poet,
did.
and you didn't know it.
Yeah. Well, oh, there. Oh,
See?
nice.
Yeah.
So for many Americans, that narrative works. Reagan wins re-election in a landslide, capturing 49 out of 50 states in 1984. Yeah, it's a big win. And he carried nearly 60% of the popular vote. But with that overwhelming victory, it also masked some deep growing divides in the country.
So let's push into Reagan's second term now. He had the public's trust, but the challenges were mounting. And one of the biggest is going to be this Iran-Contra affair that comes out in 1986 when it was revealed that senior officials within the Reagan administration had secretly sold arms to Iran, then under an arms embargo, and they used those profits to then fund the Contras, what a great name, a rebel group fighting in the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and Congress had explicitly banned this, so it was unconstitutional.
Wait, say Nicaragua.
I said it right, Nicaragua?
Okay.
I think it was fine.
Okay, well, Mr. Hill is supposed to have a great quote here.
Oh, he was doing
Ronald
his
Reagan.
Yeah. I don't think I can do it.
I'll try.
I'll try. You try, and then I'll try.
Okay, we'll both try. We'll see
You
who
try
does it
first,
better,
I'll go
Ronald
ahead.
Reagan. Okay. A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true. But the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Maybe, I think combined, if we combine both of what we did.
Like in post, we'll blend them together? Okay.
Remix.
All right, we'll give that a shot.
So that was Ronald Reagan in March of 1987. He was speaking to a national audience about the Iran-Contra scandal. And that moment really shook public confidence because, it's reminding people of the mistrust they started to have in the government after Vietnam. But Reagan's personal likability remained really high. And he often said he didn't remember key details about the affair and that many Americans, they were willing to believe him. But historians have debated, was that political theater or did Reagan's advancing Alzheimer's disease, later diagnosed in 1984, did it begin showing signs while he was still in office?
And that's really part of the Reagan legacy. It's complicated. He galvanized a conservative political coalition that you could argue still defines American politics today, although we might actually be seeing the end of the Reagan right. But he reframed government as the problem, right? And that was his key. He said we need to deregulate. We need conservative judges who could shape our courts. He tripled the national debt, mostly to defeat the evil empire as he saw it. And this led to worsening income inequality. And he turned a blind eye to the suffering of many Americans, especially during the AIDS crisis and the crack epidemic. So we have two versions of Reagan that Americans remember, and it really depends on which one you choose to focus on.
Yeah, there's a real tension also in Reagan's rhetoric. He spoke of unity, of a great shining city on a hill for APUSH students. Remember, that goes back to the colonial period, from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where I was going to say Jonathan Edwards. That's not right. George Whitefield. That's not right.
Nope, that's not right.
Even your teachers, have these moments.
We're going to have to edit this out.
Oh my gosh. The governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Winthrop.
Oh, there it is. Winthrop. See, sometimes it just takes a second. Yeah, John Winthrop, who said, that the Massachusetts Bay Colony would be this city upon a hill, and Reagan, showing that continuity then in the 1980s. But, his policies often fueled division. Communities of color, working class families, and LGBTQ plus Americans weren't really part of that, morning in America again. For them in the 80s, it was a time of disinvestment, neglect, and marginalization.
So this helps us, as Ms. Keltner was just saying, this helps us really think about continuity and change. Reagan didn't invent American conservatism, but he began to become its most iconic messenger. His presidency marks a turning point where the ideals of the New Deal era are finally being rolled back and replaced by this new vision. which included free markets, that kind of throwback to laissez-faire, a strong defensive military, traditional values, and personal responsibility. We've talked a lot about domestic policy and culture, but we'd be missing the forest for the trees if we didn't talk about Reagan's defining role on the global stage. Specifically, of course, his handling of the Cold War.
When Reagan takes office in 1981, the Cold War was in a really deep freeze. Relations with the Soviet Union had soured after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and the U.S. was reeling from a hostage crisis in Iran and a perception of weakness abroad. And Reagan wasn't subtle about all of this. In 1983, he gave one of his most famous and controversial speeches referring to the USSR as nothing less than an
evil, or that we were going to say it together.
Oh.
An
evil empire. Oh, should that be the phrase of the week? Phrase of the episode?
We just made a new thing up. Now it's phrase.
No, sometimes it can be word or it could be phrase.
So sing the song.
Phrase of the episode. Phrase of the episode. It is, in ASMR, evil empire.
Evil empire.
And this is what Ronald Reagan said in an address to the National Association of Evangelicals on March 8th of 1983.
And remember, that's how we started the episode. But when Mr. Hill gave that quote, it was to remind that part of the speech was about a need for America to look inward, to return to traditional values. But the speech also works as this way of framing the Cold War as this moral battle. It was a cosmic struggle between freedom and tyranny, good and evil. The help that Star Wars had just come out not long before this. And Reagan backed those words up with his actions. His administration dramatically increased defense spending. In many ways, this is what's going to cause the massive deficit. He ramped up production of nuclear weapons and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, otherwise known as Star Wars, a proposed missile defense system that critics called science fiction because it mostly was, but Reagan would have argued but it's what it represented to the Soviets.
And Reagan uses bellicose rhetoric. Wow, what a phrase.
Yeah.
Bellicose rhetoric and increased military spending to challenge the legitimacy of the Soviet Union. And it worked. You know, the Soviets, they were really having hardships with their economy. And they knew this was a competition. They did everything they could to try to keep up with our nuclear buildup. And it really pushes their system to the breaking point.
Yeah, as Caspar Weinberger, a U.S. Secretary of Defense, said in 1984, quote, "They can't even feed themselves," speaking of the Soviets, "and we're about to outspend them into collapse." It's fascinating how Reagan is then able to pivot in his second term. After it became clear that the Soviets were starting to crumble, Reagan actually has this interesting relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985, and Reagan saw his opening, right? The two men over time would build a nice relationship through a series of summits in Geneva, and then I was looking ahead to the next word, Reykjavik. I just said it. Yeah, Washington, Reykjavik. There it was. I said it perfectly. And over time, they build a pretty strong rapport, so much so that by 1987, Reagan no longer calling the USSR an evil empire in his speeches. Instead, he was calling for peace.
And also, we should probably note that Mikhail Gorbachev, he has two new policies, glasnost and perestroika.
Yeah.
Meaning, that he wanted to open up the Soviet economy, allow some private businesses to start coming into the Soviet Union and Russia proper. And also transparency, that the Soviet Union would be more transparent about their past, about their records. And there's a great commercial. There's a great Pizza Hut commercial.
I know. A couple of my students, shout out to those students, you know who you are, got a little angry with me that I forgot to show the Pizza Hut.
Yeah, I didn't show it this year either, but maybe during review we'll show it.
There you go.
But yeah, look up Gorbachev Pizza Hut commercial, and, it's these Russians fighting, and, it's, of course, traditionalists, the older citizens versus sort of the younger crowd. And they're like, but Gorbachev gave us pizza. Because Gorbachev, we have pizza. And it's so people will start going to Pizza Hut.
You really described that commercial well.
Well, just YouTube it. But then there becomes another iconic moment. In 1987, Reagan is going to stand before the Berlin Wall which was the most visible symbol of the Cold War, which had been, going on since 1946 when Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. And now, all these years later in 1987, this is what Ronald Reagan says in front of the Berlin Wall. And I'll do this one.
Go for it.
He says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
He sounds so frail.
He, you think of these great speeches and you hope that they're said with such conviction and emotion. But if you watch that clip, Reagan kind of stumbles over the words a little bit and he's got to clear his throat, and it really wasn't that powerful. I hope the Gettysburg Address was a lot more powerful.
No one knows. Although I guess people who were there said that it was actually.
They said it was forgettable.
It was forgettable. Yeah, no one really remembered it.
No.
He wasn't even the main speaker.
No.
See all the interesting facts you get from us. All right, 2 years later, it's 1989, and this time the wall actually does fall. Not because of Reagan alone, for sure, but I mean, we can't forget about The Boss playing that show.
Yeah, 1988.
That had a lot to do with it too. But still, Reagan's pressure, his diplomacy, the timing of the role that he plays in a critical moment definitely adds to the equation. And the Cold War, it doesn't end in this fiery battle. It ends in a series of democratic revolutions made possible by sustained American pressure and really a crumbling Soviet legitimacy.
And by the way, I'm worried our students won't know when we say the boss, we mean Bruce Springsteen.
That's right.
That is the boss. Anytime anyone refers to the boss, they're referring to Bruce Springsteen. Shout out to my mom, one of the biggest Bruce Springsteen fans ever.
Okay, how about this? I attended a Bruce Springsteen concert I think it was in St. Louis in 1985 in utero.
Oh,
my mom.
I wonder if my mom was there.
Maybe. My mom had a cut-off Bruce Springsteen T-shirt, and she was pregnant with me, so I was there.
Yeah, I've been to one. It was not in 1985.
No.
But yeah, the boss puts on a great show. Shout out to my mom.
Shout out to the boss.
So here's our key APUSH takeaway. Reagan was really transformative in the Cold War. His aggressive posture in the early 80s, followed by his surprising turn to détente. Just as a reminder, détente was really made famous by Nixon in the 70s, trying to cool the tensions with the Soviet Union. Reagan's kind of combination of both of these things helped end one of the most dangerous global conflicts in modern history. Continuity and change, cause and effect, it's all here in the Cold War.
And think about how this all connects back to Morning America. Reagan believed the U.S. was a beacon of freedom. He saw Cold War victory as both a military and moral triumph. And in the end, many Americans agreed.
So how do we see the 1980s echoing into the present? Honestly, it's everywhere. From the shape of our politics to the style of our pop culture to the way we define American values, the decade left a massive imprint.
Start with Reagan's political legacy. His belief in small government, tax cuts, and strong national defense remains the foundation of the modern Republican Party. Put an asterisk there. Maybe that's shifting, as parties tend to do, but there's no denying that Reagan's main ideas will have a lasting impact. And the idea that government is inherently inefficient, possibly dangerous, Reagan mainstreamed that. Think about debates today over universal health care, student debt relief, or climate legislation. Many of them bump up against that Reagan-era distrust of federal power.
And one way to really see Reagan's impact on the way we see our society or our government is really through the federal courts. Reagan appoints
Antonin, I believe.
Antonin. I just never say his first name.
Scalia.
I just say Scalia.
You just call him Tony?
Tony Scalia.
Yeah.
Sure. To the Supreme Court and elevated William Rehnquist to Chief Justice in the 80s. And that push for originalism, which would be the idea of interpreting the Constitution strictly based on its original meaning from the 1780s. Talk about different 80s, 200 years ago. Yeah.
Hamilton.
Right. This laid the groundwork for today's judiciary, including the Dobbs decision a few years ago that overturned Roe versus Wade in 2022.
Even Reagan's Cold War posture echoes today. His blend of this hawkish rhetoric and economic pressure shows up in how the United States has approached rivals like Russia, China, or even Iran, and his emphasis on peace through strength has shaped military budgets and foreign policy ever since.
When Reagan called the USSR an evil empire, it was a defining moral stance. But the long shadow of that binary, good versus evil, still defines American policy narratives, American foreign policy narratives. That was historian Mary Dudziak from a book, Wartime, An Idea, Its History, and Its Consequences from 2012. So, despite the foreign policy, the courts, culturally too, the 80s, really never left. MTV evolved into reality TV, which I know we both enjoyed
Big time.
in our younger years.
Oh, for sure.
Loved. Big Laguna Beach fans here, right?
Huge.
Yes.
Let the rain fall down.
Team LC or Team Kristen?
It's tough. My heart says LC, but that Kristen, every once in a while, wow. She really get after it.
She was a firecracker. She still is.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
She never did anything to make herself famous, and yet she has maintained her fame all the way till now.
Right.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Laguna Beach, throwback, reality TV. And all of this, this MTV stuff, it gives rise to our influencer culture today and political celebrity and today's image-driven politics. Reagan, the former actor, helped pioneer that. And fast forward to presidents who live on Twitter or, other forms of social media or dominate headlines with sound bites. It's the Reagan model, but it's just been digitized today.
We should also talk again about the AIDS crisis and overall public health, because in the wake of COVID-19, we saw how marginalized communities are often hit the hardest and how governments can sometimes hesitate to respond until there's just public pressure and outcry to do something. The activism of groups like ACT UP in the 1980s will create a template for health movements and justice for those health movements today.
And here's one more layer: Reagan's immigration policy. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 legalized nearly 3 million undocumented immigrants, but also increased border enforcement. And I think that sounds very familiar to us today. It's the origin of many current debates over things like DACA, border walls, and who gets to be a, quote unquote, American.
So the question that we will continue to wrestle with, talking about Reagan, but really any period of American history, is what version of America are we still living in, right? The one Reagan imagined or the one that people were fighting against in the shadows of his spotlight? And can those two versions ever truly reconcile? And I think whenever you're talking about American history, you're trying to understand the paradox of our country's past and how that echoes into the present.
So what do we take away from the 80s? This was a moment of dramatic transformation. The rise of the new right reshaped the American political map. Economic policy took a sharp turn from the New Deal legacy, and culture became a battleground for competing visions of American identity.
We'll say it again, APUSH students. Continuity and change in American political ideology, cause and effect in economic policy, in comparison between social movements. The conservative resurgence is a vital theme that we really need to remember. And as we begin to wrap up, we'd like to thank our sponsors.
Junior Java, a student-led coffee and tea company with a mission to make education more equitable worldwide. Every purchase helps support kids in need. Fuel your studies and support a great cause. Check out juniorjavacoffee.com to shop and learn more.
Okay, here we go. Thanks, Junior Java, for keeping us and history brewing.
Nice job. Good stand-in for Mr. Hill. Also, big thanks to Cats of Family Dentistry, Scrawny Arms Farm, the Healthcare Group for Women, and Right on Ruben Schlansky College Essay Tutoring. As always, we are honored by their support.
All right, that's it. That was a big episode. Thanks for tuning in to APUSH for All. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, we're on YouTube, or leave us a review on any of those spots. If you got a topic you want us to cover, send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.
you.